Well, hello and welcome to Arif Zaman's business show on Bloomsbury Radio, and a very happy new year to you, 2023. Well, if you thought 2022 was busy with all sorts of events and activities, there is a lot to look forward to this year. This is really the beginning, I suppose, of a period when we begin a year without COVID restrictions. I mean, last year there were a few, and we had a number of developments last year, but I'm really delighted that we're kicking off this year with an opportunity to speak to someone who I've known for a number of years, one of the leading authorities, and someone I've learned a lot from over the years, Dr. David Hillson, who is an authority in the area of risk. He's written about risk for many years. He's consulted in the area. In fact, I think in terms of the origins of David's work, go back to the 1980s, where David was has been involved in risk consulting for a number of years, and has developed an approach to understanding and managing risk that's been both groundbreaking and practical. He's shared his insights with clients in 60 countries and across every continent except Antarctica, ranging from major organizations, government departments, international agencies, charities, small businesses, and individuals. And one of the things that I particularly like about David's work is that he talks about risk in a way that is both intelligent but also intelligible. Which isn't always the case for people in the risk community. Sometimes we excessively use jargon and the like. But I think this is, an area risk is really everybody's business. And I think this is an opportunity today to help us understand a little bit more about that. So welcome, David. Welcome to the business show.
Well, thank you very much, Arif. It's great to have this opportunity at the beginning of this year. As you say, lots of uncertainty still about. Thank you for the kind introduction too. My motto, I've had it for probably 30 years, is understand profoundly so you can explain simply. And so, the idea is that I'll do the deep thinking, but you don't need to know about that. And the real skill is trying to turn that deep thinking into something that people can understand and use. And that's been my challenge ever since I've been involved in risk management. So people can judge for themselves at the end of our session together whether I've succeeded.
Well, no, absolutely. And we do use, I remember you did your 100 risk questions a few years ago. And I do use a number of those questions when I teach my own risk course at Bloomsbury Institute, throughout the course, because I think they are very useful. So tell us a little bit about David. I mean, you've obviously been, working, and I know we worked together on various books and publications over the years, but your own story in terms of risk, how did you get drawn into this? I mean, if someone had said to you when you were, I don't know whether as a child in school or many years ago, you'd be spending your working career in the area of risk. What sort of drew you into that? What was the sort of, I mean, even back to university days or around that period, or prior to that, when you're school, what do you think drew you into this area that you end up spending a lot of your time subsequently?
Yes, I was a child at the time of the moon landings, and I wanted to be an astronaut. So that was my childhood dream. I've never made
Right,
that. I have worked for NASA on the Constellation program and helping them to design a base station on the moon. That's
right,
the closest I've got to being an astronaut.
right.
But actually, my first career and my doctorate is actually in biochemistry. And so I did a lot of work on protein structures, early genetic engineering, controlling gene expression, and that I had 10 years in early genetic engineering work, which was quite interesting. But the research money ran out, and by a series of happenstances, I ended up working for a defense contractor who had just been told that they had to do risk management for all of their projects. And as the new guy, I kind of got dropped with the task of, well, find out what this risk management thing is and see if you can make it work for us. And so that's what I did fairly early on, and discovered the roots of risk management at that time in oil and gas, tried to take it out, distill the principles and the basic ideas and apply them to our defense projects at the time. So that's how I got started. I was kind of pushed into it because I was the most junior on the team, and I didn't step backwards quickly enough when they were looking for volunteers.
Okay, so that's fascinating, and I think that's a great, it's a reminder, perhaps even your story about the moon landings, this idea of risk as an opportunity. And I know we're going to come back to this as well
I hope
in
so.
terms of the dimensions of this. I mean, when we talk about, I suppose one question to ask actually also is, in that period from your first, I'm going back to the mid 80s up until now, what do you think has changed most about risk, and at one sort of very simple level? Is it people's understanding? Is it the complexity? Is it the sense in which policy and regulation has significantly changed, in all sorts of directions? Is it around technology? I know all of these things are important, but if you were to single out one or two things that you think,
Mm.
talking about risk in 1985, if we were having this conversation, compared to 2023, what do you think is particularly striking, particularly based on your own experience? Because you've been involved in this field from that period, but you've also worked at a very international level.
Yes, it's a fascinating question, and we could spend the whole time talking about just this, but we
Right.
won't. Certainly, when I started, risk management was seen as a technical discipline for the engineers and for the designers and the coders, and it was to make sure that we got the best possible solution with a minimal sort of hassle and rework and those sorts of things, wastage. And it was seen as a technical discipline aimed at managing threats. Now I think we have a much broader view of risk, and we see risk as part of the whole approach to life. Actually, we've survived from our earliest beginnings, whenever that was, thousands of years ago, to now, by managing risk successfully, because the whole world is very uncertain. So I think a number of things have changed. Our understanding has definitely broadened. So risk is not just about technical issues, it's the whole gamut of human endeavor and experience. It's not just about threats. As you mentioned, there is upside risk, positive risk uncertainties that will offer us benefits if we see them in time and capture them. And that understanding is only 20 or 30 years old. So that's a new view. And then I think across that piece, the idea of having to be integrated from top to bottom. So yes, there are technical risks and there are threats, but there are also strategic and corporate risks and opportunities. And we ought to take an integrated approach to managing those. So I think we've seen it as much less a technical process and much more a way of thinking, which influences all the things we do, from the technical to the strategic, from the personal to the private, everything in between. And it's a much broader discipline. That's why I'm still interested in it 35 years later.
Sure. And I suppose the profession itself, I mean, even the professional bodies, thinking of the Institute of Risk Management, and there are others, have also in that period, the whole professionalization, if you like, of the sector. Do you think that's also something that's important?
Well, there was no risk management profession when I started. I was an accidental risk manager.
Right.
I mean, I guess perhaps there was risk management in finance and banking and some of those
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
But as a profession, as it is now, that's really quite recent. And
Mm.
so the whole support infrastructure, which is in place with professional bodies and training courses and techniques and
Yeah.
guidelines and international standards and so on,
Yeah.
that's fairly new. And I think that's really helpful, because now people can fall back on that and learn from experience,
Yeah.
whereas previously we were making it up as we went along, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, no, indeed. I mean, that certainly has a significant impact. So let me just, when we talk about risk, you touched upon this a little bit already. Talk about the evolution of risk and our level of understanding of risk. Do you think that I suppose we would say that, we've had rules and regulations around for many years, particularly, we talk about health and safety risk. We talk about even areas like corporate governance. I mean, we go back to, and probably 2 decades when, that was first being mentioned. But at the same time, we're still seeing lots of examples of different kinds of risks, and people's understanding. What would you say? Our sort of current status in terms of risk, both in terms of the evolution that we're at? Do you think we're in the long game? Do you think we're still beginning to make sense of some of the ways that risk works, or do you think we're at a good level of on that journey? And what about our levels of understanding in terms of who needs to understand? Is it more, we talk about things like climate change now. Well, actually, perhaps the best people that understand climate change are the farmers that are actually out in the fields, and rather than the technocrats who are working in offices in capitals. So this idea of, broader understanding, deeper levels of understanding, more citizens engaged in this. Where do you think we're at on this in terms of, on the one hand, the evolution of risk, and on the other hand, our levels of understanding of risk?
Yes, it does depend who you mean by we. And I think, the
Right.
danger is that we take a very sort of Western centered approach, because you and I both we live in the West, but
Yeah.
you and I have also been widely exposed to other cultures and other regions of the world.
Yeah.
And so to say we have this level of maturity in our understanding or practice of risk management, I think is oversimplifying. So, I've worked in rural villages in Africa, or in remote communities, in say New Zealand or somewhere like this, and the understanding of risk is much more earthy and intuitive and real. But I've also worked with major international corporations and government bodies and so on, where they have to deal with more intangibles. So who are we when we say we have this level of maturity? It is still quite variable. And I think that's one of the challenges, is we still have to remember the basics. We have to understand our objectives, identify the uncertainties that could affect them, prioritize those, develop responses and implement them, and then see what's changed. And that is the basics of risk management.
Mm.
But then our objectives, there are multiple levels of objectives, with different organizations and different societies and groups within society. And we have different objectives, so we have different risks. There is a lot more complexity, as you say. The phrase VUCA is now
Mm.
accepted: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that introduces new dimensions of risk. And these things, I think, need to be picked up and understood and tackled by somebody, whilst others are still dealing with the very basic issues. And I think it's too easy, especially in the academic world and the kind of high-flying consultancies, to get taken up with concepts like risk efficiency or risk volatility or
Mm.
risk velocity, some of those things.
Mm.
So, well, that's really interesting. Let's play with that and
Mm.
forget the idea that actually we have, on the basic ground level, still to
Yeah.
understand and manage our risks.
Yeah, no, that's very, very well put. I mean, David, can I just start? We haven't really gone into definitions up until now, but I think it is useful, particularly given that, people listening to this, some will have um, little experience of risk, some will
Mm,
have more, it'll be a varied audience, both of students and members of the general public. And when we talk about risk, what would, I suppose that my question is in two parts. One is what give us your definition of risk, and I know you have a good one which I also use and refer to, but both a definition of risk that you find is useful, but also, and I'm just going to pin you down to maybe two or three key terms, because of course there are many,
mm,
and we'll cover some of them as we go through as well. What are some of the key words that we need to keep in our mind when we talk about risk? I know that stakeholders is certainly there, and there may be others as well, but
mm,
in terms of the like the landscape, if you like, on the one hand, what do we mean by risk? And then the second
yes.
hand, what are some of the key words, the key jigsaw pieces, if we like,
Mm,
if we
mm.
need to just keep in mind, as we better understand this whole area?
Yes. I think, when we come to understanding risk, I have this view which is starts with a point and broadens out and then goes back into another point and broadens out and comes back in again. And I think we need to start with the absolute basics, as you say, a definition, but broaden from there.
Mm.
And then once we've got a wider understanding, we need to focus in again on a few key points that we need to implement at action. And
Yeah,
out of each of these, we then broaden out. So I see it as a kind of a growing continuum. But
yeah,
for me, the absolute basic starting point in terms of definition would be three words. Risk is uncertainty that matters, because all risks are uncertain, but not all uncertainties are risks. And so the world is full of billions of uncertainties, but we don't care about them all. How do we know
mm,
which ones to care about? The
mm,
risks are the uncertainties that matter.
mm,
So I start with that as my sort of proto definition, but
yeah,
then very quickly, to make it useful, you've got to go out from there.
sure,
So what kind of uncertainty, and why does it matter, and how does it matter?
yeah,
And so that gives us two dimensions of risk. So sometimes we'll talk about probability and impact, or likelihood and consequence, but it's the chance of the uncertainty, how uncertain, and impact or consequence or effect, how much does it matter? So things come out of those two. And then we think about matters to who. So when you say stakeholders, is it the farmers on the ground, or is it the government department, or is it society at large and humanity when we're thinking about climate risk? So it matters in different ways to different people. So then we have these multiple levels of objectives and multiple levels of effect. So I think the crucial point definition is uncertainty that matters, but very quickly you leap out from that into lots of detail, which you then need to kind of categorize and shape a little bit so you can use it and begin to focus in a little bit more on, well, dimensions of risk and ownership of risk and types of objectives.
Yeah, I mean, that's very helpful. I mean, I think when it was interesting, I was at a meeting yesterday, in fact, with the Commonwealth Secretariat and the World Bank, and they were unveiling their latest World Economic Prospects, the World Bank, which has captured some headlines, around um, a more negative scenario in terms of recession, all the rest of it. But one of the questions that came up was interesting, as one of the people was asking about the impact of migration on climate change.
Mm.
Now, of course, this can create real challenges and issues because, so the economists are very good at identifying economic risks. And yet, you look at an issue like climate change, and then you look at, well, actually, the consequences of that, particularly in areas like South Asia and the Caribbean, for example, could be increased migration. This could be significant because, that could have a real impact on governments that have smaller budgets, and so they're having to cope with a lot of other demands as well. So my question is really about this, and you've touched upon it, but this interconnected nature of
Mm.
risks. And I know that there
Mm.
are these two words that we were just talking about a bit earlier, this word of polycrisis and permacrisis, which
Yes.
I think the Financial Times, as business journalists sometimes like to do, to say these were the words of the year. And I believe polycrisis, from a piece that Adam Toes, who teaches at Columbia, wrote to the Financial Times in October last year, talked about polycrisis. But I also, just a few hours ago, the World Economic Forum, who've just today released their latest global risk report, which is a very, one of the world's leading sort of reviews of risk in preparation for the World Economic Forum later this month. They also, in the press conference, there was some discussion around this word polycrisis. So
Mm.
can I just ask you to elaborate a little bit? Well, I think the main point is about this word interconnected, because I think that's where
Mm.
what this is. But when we talk about this idea of poly and permacrisis, of course, we're also recognizing that we've had, people thought, well, Brexit was a big thing, and then we had, the impact of a Trumpian presidency, which had its own sort of wider implications. And then we had, of course, COVID, and then we've had Ukraine war, and I'm sure that there'll be something else around the corner. So, and you mentioned VUCA, but I think this interconnected idea has driven this sort of these words permacrisis and polycrisis. And I'd welcome your help in trying to unravel and unpick a little bit of that from where you sit.
Yes, in polycrisis, I think the idea is of multiple different crises all occurring at the same time, and clearly the interconnectedness issue comes out of that. Permacrisis was the word of the year for Collins, the Collins English Dictionary for 2022, and they call that an extended period of instability and insecurity,
Mm,
especially resulting from a series of catastrophic events. So they likewise are saying there's a number of things going on together here, which
mm,
create this kind of this broader insecurity. And interconnectedness is absolutely vital to consider as a cause of risk, a source of risk, or a risk enhancing factor. And that leads us to the question of complexity. I mean, the C of VUCA is complexity, and complexity is certainly increasing in our world today. And we do have to be able to understand emergent risk, which appears out of complexity in a way that wasn't necessarily foreseeable or predictable in advance.
mm,
So you have a number of factors which are all interacting together, and those interactions are some of them synergistic and some of them are negative.
mm,
So together, you move something in a system and something pops up somewhere completely unexpected. So, for example, we had COVID, and then we had lockdowns. That perhaps wasn't expected at the level of that we had it. And then out of that, we've got supply chain problems.
Yeah.
And then we've got the great resignation, where people
Yeah.
decided that not working was quite fun, and they'd
Yeah.
rather stay that way.
Yeah.
And then migration actually creates an opportunity. I mean, people in Germany, for example, welcomed the migrants to say,
Yeah.
well, we need more people. We're running out of people in Germany. All our
Sure.
native population have got older. Let's welcome these people, and they can help us by seeing migration not as a threat, but as an opportunity, contrasted with the way we see it over here in the UK,
Yeah.
where we also have a manpower crisis, but we're pushing people back from the borders for other reasons. So I
Yeah.
think the complexity, interconnectedness somebody needs to get their head around it. There's a very good outfit in Australia called the International Centre for Complex Project Management, ICCPM. And
Mm.
although they've got the word project in their title, the complexity is their real area of interest. And they've done some really good work in trying to understand and define different types of complexity and how that interacts with risk and uncertainty, how we need to think about emergent risk in the context of complex systems, and then
Mm.
apply that into real organizations. And I see that as one of the big areas where we need to develop risk management in the future.
Yeah, no, and I suppose, the importance of sort of, well, I mean, of using technology and data, of course, can be helpful there. In fact, just while we've been speaking, I've just seen that all US domestic flights have been grounded for
Yes,
several hours from a technical glitch. So
I
literally,
noticed.
the world evolves in real time.
Yes, exactly.
And as someone who used to work for British Airways for many years, for when you've got the world's biggest economy having all flights grounded, that's not the kind of thing that happens every day of the week. So that is quite a major development, even if it's for a few hours.
Yes, exactly.
So very, very interesting. David, I know that I mean, we're going to come on to some of these ideas in a few moments when we talk about your latest book, The Risk Hurricane, which is great. I mean, a great title. By the
Oh,
way,
thank you.
we'll come back to that. But I wanted to, before we get to that, pick up on, I know you've been prolific in terms of your work and your writing, and I've been, privileged to be able to, contribute some, chapters over the years to books that you've written. We're going to come on to one that's coming out shortly. But I know that there are two or three things. Well, there were three things I wanted to pick up on from recent work that you've done or have done over a number of years. I'll say what they are. I'll give you the headline, and then we can sort of go from there.
Mm,
Clearly, your work on risk attitude, which was really groundbreaking, both in terms of what it is, but also this idea of group risk attitude. And I'd like to ask a little bit about that, and of course, that may also link into things like groupthink. The other area that I know you've been quite involved over the years and also worked with the Institute of Risk Management and others is this whole area of risk appetite,
mm,
helping us understand that. And then I think quite recently, and this is an area that I've always been very interested in, this whole area of decision making. And I think your book on making risky and important decisions, which is also quite recent. So I know that those are three distinct areas, but I know those are books or work that you've actually significantly worked on over the years. Can I just ask you to say something about those in relation to what chose you to look at those areas,
mm,
and where do you think, based on what you did then, whether it was 5, 10 years ago, whatever, how relevant are they right now in 2023?
mm. Yes, I started at the basic technical level, as I mentioned, and so my first interest in risk management was process and making sure that we had a way of exposing and understanding those individual risks that were affecting us, and then a good framework for prioritizing them and dealing with them. And so I was very focused on process, and I need to name check a collaborator who's helped me broaden from there, right from about 1999, and that's Dr. Ruth Murray Webster.
Yeah.
And Ruth and I have written 4 books together, which are the ones around risk appetite, risk attitude, and risky decision making, because she came at this from a people side, and I came from a process side. And initially, we had a little sort of contretemps about, well, my view is more important, no, your view is more important. And then we realized that they both were, and they needed to be approached in a complementary way.
Yeah.
And so Ruth is really responsible for broadening my thinking into the people side, and then interfacing that with the whole process. So that we started with risk attitude. Your view of a risk will be different from my view of risk. Why is that?
Yeah.
Is risk attitude embedded or inherent and unchangeable? Of course not, because we have different attitudes to risk in different arenas. So I actually quite enjoy some risky sports, skydiving, for example, or abseiling. And then I might be very cautious in my investments over my pension. So my risk attitude is very different in different circumstances. So if I can hold different risk attitudes against different contexts, can I change my risk attitude? And we discovered that by applying emotional literacy, emotional intelligence to the risk challenge, we can understand our starting point, our risk preferences, but actually intentionally change those so that we can adopt a risk attitude which is more suitable to the environment that we're in. So if I'm about to undertake a skydive and I remember I try and apply my pension investment strategy to the skydive, I just hang on in the back of the plane and never go anywhere near the entrance or the exit. So we have to modify our risk attitude. Well, if I could modify it, can I do that intentionally? And can I use that to help me in different circumstances? So that was our sort of insight, our first insight into that area, and seeing that individuals and then groups interacting together have different influences on them, and trying to distill that down into 4 or 5 key influences that we need to understand. And then out of that comes the question, well, how much risk is enough, or how much risk is too much? And that introduces the question of risk appetite. How much risk are you prepared to take in pursuance of your objectives? And again, is that fixed or is that variable? How hungry are you? Well, the answer is eat something. But does that change your base hunger? Yes, it does. So you're no longer hungry once you've satisfied it. And how do we apply those ideas to risk and risk taking? And that naturally leads us towards decision making. And so what Ruth and I have done in the last book, the Making Risky and Important Decisions, is try to distill all of our sort of groundbreaking thinking on attitudes and appetite into this area, the key area of how do I use that to make decisions that are risky and important. Risky where there's some aspect of uncertainty that really matters in the decision, and important because the way we decide will affect something significant on the other side. So we've taken all of that together and tried to distill it into a 7-step sort of framework that you can use to make good decisions.
When we talk about decision making and risk, of course, I suppose it comes together, doesn't it, in more recent years? There's been this whole emphasis on risk oversight by directors in corporate governance. Do you think when we talk about decisions, that's really the key locus for this?
Well, we all make risk-based decisions, but most of us do it in our guts and intuitively, and we don't understand how and why we do it. And what Ruth and I are trying to do in our work is to expose some of the influences so that we can look at them intentionally and say, why do I do this? Why do I feel like this? Is it appropriate? And if not, how do I change it? And I think when it comes to risk appetite for organizations, for corporations, or to an oversight in corporate governance, people are still reacting from the gut very largely because they don't understand, understand how to influence these things and on what's driving them. So I think it is important that we look at this a little bit more closely, because there are some big decisions being made about people's futures, about society, about culture, about international relations, which are all very, very risky and very, very important. And if we just go with our gut feel, then the person who has the biggest influence, or maybe the biggest checkbook, gets to call the shots, and that's not always appropriate.
And this idea, which is inherent in what you're also talking about, and something else that I know you've also written about, but this idea you touched upon at the beginning of opportunity and not just being, seeing risk in a negative sense. Is that idea of seeing the upside of risk, is that inherent in all of the 3 things that you just referred to in terms of risk appetite, risk attitude, and also making decisions?
Absolutely. I mean, why would you take a risk if there wasn't any potential benefit,
Right.
apart from removing a threat, of course? But I've always seen our ability to understand and manage risk as a competitive advantage, because when you're in a competitive situation, everybody faces the same kinds of uncertainties in the environment and in the kind of field that they're operating in. And the organization that succeeds will be the one that can understand and manage those risks the best. And we could actually sell that as part of our USP. We're the organization that will take the right risks on your behalf, but take them safely and achieve our objectives in the optimal way. Whereas somebody else who doesn't really understand the risks will go into things blindly. They might bid below us and think they can do it faster and cheaper, but they'll be hit by things that they hadn't foreseen and ultimately end up spending more and wasting time and perhaps not even achieving the goals. So I think when we're talking about making risky decisions or about taking risk in organizations, we have to consider the upside and the benefits of taking risk in order to create things that couldn't be created if we didn't.
Yeah, but I remember when Lord Marshall, the former chairman and chief executive of British Airways, who was actually there when it was privatized, and I joined British Airways just 36 months after they were privatized in 1989, there for 16 years. I remember that he was when he was chair, and I did a project as part of my MBA when I was at British Airways on reputational risk. That's how I got involved in that area. I remember that he took the initiative in getting established what we referred to in British Airways as the ROMG, the Risk and Opportunity Management Group, and I thought it was fascinating. I mean, in terms of historical context here, this is about 1998. 1997, so quite some time ago, but very interesting. And I think, and I remember, and basically it was like a star chamber. They would call in people from different parts of the organization, and you'd have the head of risk management, you'd have the head of strategic planning, you'd have the chief internal auditor, and you'd have the company secretary, and those four individuals would ask a series of questions of the respective part of the organization to a kind of a template which they had filled out. And I did sit in on some of those meetings when I was doing that research. But I think it was fascinating for me, picking up on what you were saying, this deliberate use of language, that it wasn't called the risk committee, and I think it was this idea of risk and opportunity management group. But I think also, even because Colin Marshall was very good about picking up, being a former marketeer, very good at picking up on things like language. So in fact, calling it a group, not a committee either, all of those words were very interesting. The risk and opportunity management group. So do you think I mean, so my question is around language. Do you think, we talk about upside, we talk about positive, we talk about opportunity. Is language, everything when we come to risk, or would you want to comment on that in terms of?
Well, of course it's not. Of course it's not everything, because obviously action is everything. We want to manage risk.
Sure.
It's risk management.
Yeah.
But language frames our thinking,
Right.
and so when you speak a certain way, you are unconsciously or subconsciously shaping the idea in order to be able to say it in a particular way. So the current thinking on language is not risk and opportunity, actually, because what that does is it allows you to separate the two and say, well, I've got risks over here, and we'll do risk management, which is really dealing with negative things. And opportunity is somehow different. Whereas if you go back to my initial starting point of uncertainty that matters, some uncertainties matter because they could hurt you, and some uncertainties matter because they could help you. And both of those are uncertainties that matter. So if that's our proto definition of risk, then opportunities are risks and threats are risks.
Right.
And so the language that I prefer and have been promoting and has some has been taken up in some way, is that risk has two flavors. Risk is threat and opportunity, and then we have threat and opportunity. So my risk methodology is called ATOM, active, threat and opportunity management, because those are our two flavors of risk. And the best way to handle them is in an integrated way, because some opportunities arise out of the threats and some threats arise from our opportunities. We need to see these together. And so a risk register has risks in it that includes threats and opportunities. And risk management is about minimizing threats and maximizing opportunities in an integrated way, because they're related. So language is really very important, because it frames the way we think about these things. And we need to think about risk in that broader way.
So that's a great segue, David, to the word hurricane, because this was the title of your most recent book, which I think just came out a few months ago, I think, didn't it? The risk. So one question to ask you, very practical. There it is, the taming the risk hurricane, indeed.
Exactly.
So interestingly, and I'm assuming, but you'll correct me if I'm mistaken, did you start working on this once COVID had started? I mean, was your Was this, to what extent was this influenced by this very different world that we were suddenly in, where we couldn't move up, get out of our house and all the rest of it? Or I mean, tell me before we get into the messages of the book and what that was about. Tell me a little bit about the genesis of the book and the use of the word hurricane and that context. I'd be fascinated to know.
I'm sorry to disabuse you, but it has nothing to do with COVID at all. I've been writing this
Okay.
book for 3 years.
Before COVID,
Yes,
right?
well
Okay.
before COVID, and
Okay.
the early part of it, actually, I can show you the drafts with the dates on, which go really back some way. But the idea is that I've been thinking about corporate crisis management and how risk management and crisis management should relate together.
Yes.
And I was looking for a metaphor. I think metaphors are really powerful in the way that we can take one thing and help us to understand something else.
Yeah.
You have something that is well defined and we know a little bit about, and you draw insights out of that
Yeah.
to shed light on things that we don't know so much about.
Yeah.
And so, the whole concept of a corporate crisis, and let's use the language, things are swirling around, and
Yes.
there's this kind of vortex of change, and then there's a kind of a sweet spot in the middle where the senior management sit and it all seems calm and things are whirling around them, and there are people losing their jobs, and all sorts of things are going on around them. It's the hurricane is the picture that goes with this image of a vortex of change.
Mm,
So I had the picture of the hurricane in my mind as initially.
mm.
I then read another book. Do I have it up here? Never mind. I have another book by somebody else called Joseph Mayo, which is it's called Cultural Calamity. And he's looking at cultural risk within organizations.
Mm.
And he coined the term risk hurricane, but he only used it in a cultural context. So I wrote to Joe, I reviewed his book, and I contacted him. I said, it's a great metaphor, but you've only just scratched the surface. Would you like to collaborate and develop it further to talk about risk more generally? And he said, actually, I've moved on to something else. I'm not really interested in doing that, but feel free to take the metaphor and run with it. And you can have the term, you can use it, but he's the originator.
Mm.
So Joseph Mayo originated the term risk hurricane
Mm.
and then allowed me to use it and expand it. So really, I then started looking at hurricanes more generally, what we know about where they come from,
Yep.
the preconditions, the kind of preparation that people make, how you survive an actual event, and how you clear up afterwards. And each of those you could see as metaphors for something that happens in corporate crisis.
Mm. Okay, so it really did chime really, and when you looked at that application of weather construct to a corporate to a chaos really that arises in a
Yes, and
corporate
we talk about
environment.
corporate climate, don't we? And
Yeah.
the winds of change, and there's all sorts
Yes.
of other sort of metaphors that come from the weather.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes, I thought it was quite fitting.
So talk us through a little bit more about the book itself, then, in terms of what were the key messages from this, and also in relation to, and although you've absolutely correctly clarified the important point around COVID, but I suppose in relation to the point we're at now, I mean, we were
Mm.
talking earlier about the nature of these interconnected crises, and what are the key messages from this book, and how would you position it in relation to where we sit right now at the beginning of
Mm.
2023?
Mm. I think one of the key messages is that the unmanageable is manageable.
Right.
That even things that you have no control over that arise, like the weather, we can't control the weather.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
hurricanes arise for very well understood reasons, but they come and they go where they will.
Yeah.
And if you're in the path, you're just stuck with it. You have to deal with what comes,
Yeah.
but you can deal with it. So it's not a complete surprise that you open the curtains one morning and there's a hurricane. It will have been forecast and it will have been developing for many weeks beforehand. And the same with corporate crisis. You don't just suddenly wake up. I mean, some do in the
Mm.
organization. It's a great shock when you suddenly find we're about to, the receivers are coming in and we're about to go bust. But it was predictable. And if it's predictable, you could have prepared for it, and you could have prepared to weather the storm. You protect yourself in advance and to clear up afterwards, and then to have a plan in place when the crisis hits. And so
Mm.
the message is that even things that are uncontrollable and appear to come out of the blue, you can understand in advance and do something about. So one of my other pictures is the idea of risk being a forward-looking radar. it scans the future and it says, what's out there coming my way? What can I see that might be big and bad and I have to avoid, or big and good and I have to steer towards? And so the risk radar automatically leads you to that idea of weather and seeing the storm developing over there. And this is the potential track. And how do I deal with that? And there are, of course, upsides from natural hurricanes as well as from risk hurricanes. So, you know, it clears the ground, allows you, it reveals what's weak and vulnerable, clears it out the way and allows you to rebuild and perhaps build back better. So it builds into that idea of resilience that we've talked about.
I think this, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, in terms of the book, when I have a copy right now in front of me, which I'm looking at, I mean, I think I mean, you've obviously, you know, I think quite skillfully, you've used a set of words beginning with the letter P for your chapters, which I think is always easier if you can use that iterative sort of approach, or you know, or that approach. You talk about preconditions, you go on to talk about potency and people, and then prediction, and you mentioned preparedness, and then post-event responses and practicalities. I mean, all of these things there. But I suppose, you know, if you think about your comment about language, one of the words that is really seized a lot of attention in probably the last 3 or 4 years in particular is the word ecosystem. And although we talk about ecosystems, you know, comes out of biology, and I remembered I was terrible at biology, but I do remember a concept when I was probably 12 or 13 in my biology class that fascinated me, which was the word ecosystem. And I've
Yes.
never forgotten that word, even though I was terrible in science at school. I remember that word throughout my life. But this word ecosystem, you know, has now been picked up and been looked at more broadly. We talk about entrepreneur ecosystems, other kinds of ecosystems. And I suppose with this thing about hurricane as well, you know, trying to draw upon what we learn, or we know, as you were saying, about climate and hurricanes, and applying that to corporate context. How easy was that to do as you got more into that, and as you were, you know, developing this further, and as you were breaking down this into the areas that we just mentioned, or I just mentioned in terms of those P's? How well did that work as you were exploring that?
Well, I think I mean, I've written a number of books, and I think it's important to know what you want to say beforehand. And actually, it became quite simple because I already knew what I thought about corporate crisis, and I was looking for a way, a
Right,
vehicle of expressing that. And
right,
so along comes the hurricane, and I'm immediately going, oh yeah, this is this, and this is this, and this is this, and the book just fell out. I mean, it took
right.
me 3 years to write, and there were, you know, other reasons for that.
Yeah.
But still, it was a great joy to write because it actually was quite easy. And as I was finding out, for example, about how meteorologists predict the path of a hurricane,
Mm,
I'm seeing, oh, that's what we do in our risk predictions with our risk modeling. And you can see how they have a cone of uncertainty, which broadens out as you go into the future. And we have a risk cone of uncertainty where you
right.
know what's going to happen in the next week. You don't know what's going to happen in the next month. You have no idea what's going to happen in the next year. And out goes the cone of it, this is that. And I was just delighted, you know, I had real fun with it because I kept spotting things. And there are things I've missed that other people pick up and say,
Mm,
oh, don't forget there's that as well. So it was actually, I knew what I wanted to say about corporate crisis. And the fun part was picking out the elements of the metaphor to use to actually say that. And there were some things that I hadn't thought about in terms of, for example, risk communication.
yes,
So, you
yes.
know, you have local authorities, they have hurricane watches and hurricane warnings.
Yeah,
A
yeah,
hurricane watch says, you know, it might happen to you sometime in the next couple of weeks. A hurricane warning says, go now. And between the two, you
yeah,
need to do your preparation, work out where the
yeah,
escape routes are and who are you going to
yeah,
tell and what do you take with you.
yeah. I mean, I think that whole area of risk communication is really a fascinating one. I know that someone who you'll doubtless know, Paul Slovic, has done a lot of
Mm,
work over the years in risk perception and also in
yes,
terms of risk communication.
I know him well. We actually collaborated together on a couple of things already.
Yeah, well, that no, well, there you go. One of the great gurus of in the world of risk, and someone who I learned a huge amount from, you know, when I was doing my initial work on reputational risk, some of his earlier
Mm,
work. Um, but this sort of focus on you know on this idea of a hurricane
Mm.
and corporate crises. To what extent is that something that I mean, you talked about this a bit earlier. When you look at different regions, you look at different different communities and cultures, you look at different countries at different stages of developing. Of different stages of development. I mean, do you think that this, as you wrote the book and as you drew in examples, did you find that this was a fairly universal framework that could be applied, or did it particularly suit some regions or countries more than others?
No, I think it is a universal framework. And in the natural world, hurricanes pass through underdeveloped countries and developed countries, and they
Mm,
hit big cities and they hit rural villages. And the effect is different depending on the infrastructure and the capability and the resilience of the community and of the natural environment. So, but the framework, the hurricane is the same. And I
mm,
think what I've tried to do in the chapters of the book, for example, preconditions,
mm,
we talk about warm water and low pressure and circulating winds. And
mm,
I think there are three parallel things that cause risk hurricanes. The warm water is our uncertain environment and the things around us which are heating up and creating that kind of turbulence.
mm,
But then the low pressure represents our corporate culture, where there are
mm,
vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the way we think and relate together, in the way we communicate our values, and that combines with the warm water to create some vulnerability. But it's
mm,
the vortex, the circulating winds of change. When the three come together, you suddenly find you begin to get some uncontrollable extreme uncertainty, which can really affect you significantly. So I think those factors, the external environment, the internal environment, and the forces of change affect
mm,
everybody right around the world. They affect them in different ways, but
mm,
the factors are common, I believe. And things like the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report, which you
mm,
mentioned, is actually, the current issue is out today or tomorrow.
mm.
That's what that's about, giving you that risk landscape,
Yeah.
those top risks, the way things have changed and are developing. That's really helpful as part of our radar, of our forecasting system, to
Yeah.
see what's out there and which could turn into something significant.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, when I talk about risk in fact, my own view on this actually was that after doing, when I was doing work with the Commonwealth Business Council and corporate governance, I felt that actually getting to people on boards talking about risk was probably a bit late. You're probably trying to get them at university when they haven't got into bad habits of this, that, the other.
Mm, mm,
And I've really enjoyed actually developing this course and delivering it at Bloomsbury Institute on risk. But one of the things that I tend to do is I've partly certainly influenced by the work that you've done and people like Paul Slovic and others over the years. I talk about the what do we know, what do we do, and what do we say. And so the what do we know is around the risk analysis, the risk identification, and then the risk management. What do we do is about the risk management, and about the
mm,
what do we say, which is exactly this point around risk communication. And I think that whole area of risk communication is one that I've been particularly fascinated by. So I suppose my question to you, and again linking into your work on the hurricane, and again, I'm sorry to again go back to COVID, but I thought it was fascinating because I thought
mm,
that the way that risk was communicated through that whole period, not just in the UK, but we saw it communicated very differently by a US president at the time.
yes.
President Trump had a particular way of communicating risk, and
Mm,
then you had
yes.
other countries of the world, parts of East Asia, that some were better than others. Then you had the
Mm,
UK, and so this whole area of risk communication, and then you had the other point, I suppose, is that you had organizations then having to grapple this and put it
mm.
in their own terms and language. So I suppose my question is, from your work on the hurricane risk and on risk communication, and your broader reflections on how COVID has perhaps affected our thinking about this, do you think risk communication is something that we look at slightly differently now with different levels of understanding, or do you think not?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, as you say, in the UK, we had those briefings with the Prime Minister and the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer, or their representatives, and that helped us understand the dimensions that we were facing. There was a political, sort of social dimension, there
Yeah,
was a scientific dimension, and a medical dimension, and they
yeah,
were all different but related.
Yeah.
And we saw the value of each of those perspectives to different degrees, depending
Yeah.
on our filters,
Yeah.
and some of us will receive scientific information easier than political information, and others
Yeah.
the other way around. Um, but I think we began to see the value of that communication, and you compare it, as you say, with Trump or Bolsonaro on the one hand, sort of the COVID deniers, if you like,
Yeah.
and then South Korea and Singapore and New
Yeah.
Zealand,
Yeah.
exemplary, really,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
way ahead of us.
Yeah.
So I think having then those sort of case studies of different types of communication and seeing what worked and what didn't helps us to understand for
Yeah.
other settings what we should be
Yeah.
thinking about.
Yeah, no, indeed. I think that's a very powerful point. I mean, just a couple of things to pick up on just as we bring things to a close in the next 4 or 5 minutes. I just wanted to touch on very briefly, and I know we'll come back to this later, the Risk Management Handbook, which is now going through a second edition. I've contributed a chapter on reputational risk, and there are others that are in process. And in fact, there it is. That's the first edition, I think,
It
isn't it?
is, yes.
That's the first edition. So, so maybe just say something very briefly about that in a couple of minutes, and then also something else I just wanted to ask you about, and I know this is an area that you have some interest in, about the Commonwealth and to what extent the risk in the Commonwealth can provide, a framework through which to bring common understanding together as well. So, on each of those, over to you.
The Risk Management Handbook is a book that we published some years ago, and the concept was that each chapter was written by a domain expert in different types of risk. So you wrote about reputation, we've got country risk, political risk, project risk, and so on. And then I topped and tailed it, and we had a common structure so that people could compare different types of risk and look for the commonalities, but also the distinctives. And it was some years ago the first edition came out. It's been quite widely adopted, used in universities for teaching, in lots of different settings. But the world's moved on. And so it is time for a second edition. So the second edition is now just about to go into production. I think it's due in August 2023. And for this second edition, we've got authors, 24 authors from 8 countries on 4 continents. So a very broad international perspective. And 8 new authors to the team, as well as you and myself, who have written before. There's 8 new authors in there, and 4 new topics. So we've introduced financial risk, climate change risk, legal risk, and then ESG, the economic, social and governance, environmental, social and governance risk, which is a new area. So as the risk discipline, the risk landscape has changed, we've brought the book up to date. Obviously, new international standards, 31,000, and the family. There's a 31,020, which is managing legal risk, for example. And the new chapter in the book is written by the person who actually authored that international standard, Sam Da Silva. So, we're really drawing on the current expertise to present current good practice in the same kind of format that we had before.
That's very exciting, and certainly when that's out, we'll certainly obviously come back and have a follow-up conversation with that. And it was a real pleasure to be part of that experience as well. The final question, really, I touched upon the Commonwealth. So Commonwealth, I know you've worked across many different countries, but we've spoken at times, and I think a year or so ago you participated in a panel discussion with the University of London, the Institute of Commonwealth Studies on risk in the Commonwealth. Do you think that there is this commonality that we could leverage more, particularly across these 56 countries, which are connected through common legal infrastructures and all the rest of it, that can help us manage uncertainty better?
Absolutely. I think the great strength of the Commonwealth is that there's 2 factors. One is commonality and the other is diversity. So we have common values and we have common sort of structures and a common framework, but we have very different perspectives on the world because of our history, because of our demographics, because of our natural environment and so on. And so I think it's a very ripe forum for exploring and learning from one another, exploring the idea of resilience further. Resilience is perhaps one of the themes, as I mentioned at the beginning, which we're going to see in the risk context developing more strongly, because it's the answer to emergent risk. It's the answer to hurricanes, actually, is how resilient am I and what can I do about that now in order to build resilience for the future. So I think the Commonwealth is a great forum for drawing on that diversity within a common framework and actually bringing together something that we can all use that will benefit everybody.
No, that's very well put. Well, David, it's been a real, I'm not sure whether I would use the word masterclass, but it's been a real enjoyable experience. It's a real conversation, but also an opportunity really to, and I've known you for many years, but a real opportunity to just spread ourselves across the canvas, from your early days right through to your most recent work on the risk hurricane and everything in between, and your broader observations. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, and we look forward to the book that's coming out, the Risk Management Handbook, and the Risk Hurricane is out there now, and other work. And for those people who want to know more, you have your website, the Risk Doctor,
risk-doctor.com, risk-doctor.com, and there's also the YouTube channel, the Risk Doctor Video YouTube channel, which is a good place to find out a lot more.
Yeah, no, there is a lot of material there and very accessible as well. So, David, thank you so much for joining me today, and much appreciated. And all that remains for me to say is stay safe, stay well, most of all, stay happy, and bye for now.
Goodbye.